Going
Thank
to
you.
share the screen right now. Let's share. And this I should close. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yeah, that'll close as well. And I have the presentation open here. This is that's another thing that I'm working on right now. And this is a presentation actually that I'm going to share with you because I'm working on it right now. And it's what is freshest in my brain. But it's something that has been cooking in my mind for a long time right now. I would say for maybe a decade. But okay, let me put that there so that it doesn't bother. But basically, right now we're doing a seminar here at Yale, but we're also doing it in Temuco, Chile, which is absolutely fantastic. Because if there's one thing that COVID has allowed for is that we can simultaneously be in very many places. And this is not an experience I had had before in my life. So I'm teaching here at Yale. And the reason why I'm here, Fernando, is because my visa was to expire on September 16th. And I went back to Ecuador early in June thinking, no problem, I'll just get my visa renewed and go back to the US with a renewed visa. But the consulate was closed, and it was closed in June, in July, in August, and I started freaking out. So I asked the school, what should I do? Because I have an F1. And they said, just get on a plane and come back before your visa expires. Because once it expires, if you're here with your I-20, you can remain within status. But if you go, if you're in Ecuador, you won't be able to come in as a student. You will lose your status. And that meant that, I just couldn't move forward with anything really. So I managed to get my visa renewed literally the day that I flew to the US.
I know I had all those visas. It's part of
my God.
Part of our life.
I think I have had about 25 visas by now to the US, but I persist in my Ecuadorian nationality. I don't know why. Sometimes it's so complicated. But anyway, the interesting thing is that in the end, I ended up here, and I'm seeing my students every week because we have a hybrid mode right now at Yale. And I'm teaching the same exact seminar with the same exact syllabus in Temuco. And a friend of mine is participating from La Paz, Fernando Martinez, you probably know him. And the interesting thing is that students from all over Latin America have written to me that for some reason learned about the seminar and are participating. One of them is in Sao Paulo, another one is in Argentina. And, I'm happy to have all these Latin American students join us. And we've had many archaeologists come to lecture in the seminar, mainly archaeologists. And the more I listen to them, the more I confirm that my intuition, because sometimes we just have an intuition, but we don't have the evidence to support it. But, the evidence is just accruing. And that's what I want to share with you today. Why is this not going down? Maybe with this, no. With that, oops. But that intuition maybe started actually a long time ago. When I talk about 89. This was in the 90s, early in the 90s. My first salaries I saved and I went to Peru. It was my dream to go to Peru. And I really wanted to go to Machu Picchu. And I was lucky because when I went there, Peru was not a pole of tourism in the way it is right now. And the Shining Path was still active. And for the most part, foreigners were very scared of going to Peru. So I was able to go to Cusco and to walk from Ollantaytambo all the way up to Machu Picchu in almost complete solitude. I was with two friends who were actually both of them Americans. And one was from Michigan, the other one was from California. And, with Peruvian tour guides, because we didn't know how to get from Ollantaytambo to Machu Picchu. So we had these guides that we hired in Cusco, and they guided us all the way up. And it was a fascinating experience. It was life-changing. And one thing, there's someone in the waiting room, I believe. I'll just admit it. And the one thing that really amazed me, not just in Machu Picchu, which is obviously glorious, but in the path towards Machu Picchu, was that there was something about Inca architecture that I felt, and I shouldn't even call it just architecture, but something about the way of the way in which the Inca placed themselves in the landscape that was completely different from any Western assumption that I had in my brain at that point in my life. I wasn't an architect at that point. I was actually studying liberal arts at Universidad de San Francisco, and my major was in anthropology. So I was amazed by this site and the way in which the mountain, the architecture, the infrastructure, the cultural landscape, and the environment all seemed to weave into each other. They were inseparable. And that definitely pointed to what now I just call a different urban ontology in the ancient Americas. But this was the first Inca site I had seen in my life, and I hadn't seen sites from other cultures. So for me, it was an isolated phenomenon. Now I'm realizing it's a Pan-American ancestral ontology. But let me go down a little bit. But this ontology reveals itself in very many ways. And one of them is definitely the language. This poster is quite recent, and a friend of mine who's a linguist shared it with me, an amazing linguist from Ecuador. She's been studying not just Amazonian, but all sorts of indigenous languages all her life. And the government hired her to translate the posters that gave the message, quédate en casa, during the COVID pandemic. And she went into a crisis because when she was translating, for example, this specific poster for the Wa, who live in the Chocó area, more, the rainforest towards the Pacific in southern Colombia and northern Ecuador, she thought, how am I going to translate quédate en casa if casa translates as forest in the Awa language? And I thought this was a mind-boggling concept. Because what do you do as an architect when you're facing a culture? Just as a linguist goes into a crisis, as an architect, you go into a crisis when you're facing a culture that literally defines the house as forest. Then how do you do architecture in this place? How do you do the house in a place where house is forest? And I think that this is very revealing of how in the Americas, the members of what I try to call original nationalities or the first peoples, because many of my quote unquote indigenous friends have told me that they don't like the term indigenous. That, they tell me I'm a Shuar, just refer to me as Shuar, but there are hundreds of cultures in Latin America. So, when we come up with a generic, we use Native American, we use indigenous, we use Amerindian, we've thought about all sorts of words, but none of them seem to work. But the one that
we lost Ana Maria's audio. Is that only me that lost, or?
No, me too.
That's what I wanted to ask. Well, it was only me that has a frozen image of Ana.
I think she's back. Ana Maria, you back? There was something with the internet.
You're muted, I think.
Disconnected you. I see that you are back, but you're muted.
Oh, weird. So the screen, I lost, you're not seeing my screen anymore.
Not anymore, no. I think you got disconnected, so you don't need to.
I got disconnected. How strange. What was the last thing that you guys heard?
How to call the original inhabitants, Amerindians or First Nations or First people.
I'm going to share the screen again. Oops. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. So anyway, I'm just going to use First Nations as much as I can. And but you did hear the component of the habitat, like how do you do architecture in a
the forest, yes.
Yeah, that's the most important concept that I want to project with these like, okay. And of course, we're facing a moment of immense complexity from both the environmental and the social standpoint. And we're facing a moment in which fire seems to be the main symbol of what's happening. Not, we're not just burning churches in Chile or burning a corporate skyscraper in Chile in the past October, or in the case of Ecuador, the Contraloría, or in the case of the US, the police department.
Or Notre Dame de Paris.
Notre Dame that burned earlier, through accidents than social ignition. But it seems that there's a lot of fire right now happening everywhere. And much of this fire is also affecting ecosystems, like in Brazil, what has happened with the whole dismantlement of the environmental laws in Brazil that had been pulling down the ratio of deforestation in the country for more than a decade. And suddenly to see that curve shift and go boom, almost perpendicularly back to fires that we hadn't seen since the 70s, really. But it's not just happening in Brazil, it's happening in Bolivia, in Peru, in Ecuador, everywhere. And in the face of all of this, you start looking for alternatives. And in my case, I've gone back to look at the pre-Columbian chapter of Amazonia, and through it, the pre-Columbian chapter of the Americas, because I'm realizing that what I see in Amazonia, the answers that I have found in Amazonia are answers that are actually all over the place. But since the 1950s, when an archaeologist, Gordon Childe, came up with the concept of the urban revolution and the Neolithic revolution, we have been in books that address urbanism and city making, we have been treating this process as a linear phenomenon. And basically the logic, the urban revolution as it is, defines it, is that a surplus in agriculture is the sine qua non of cities. And it is this surplus that can sustain populations that are liberated from food production, and then they can apply themselves to specialize more complex activities. And this is, like an underlying logic in the way we understand the origin of the city, the genesis of the city. And this obviously has been questioned already. But one thing that lingers as well from Childe, and I'm not critiquing, I think there's a lot of truth to this, but the linear narrative is too linear, and we'll discuss that further down when we talk about Scott. But also the other element that he left behind that has defined archaeology up to this day, and I think that also urbanism, because these ideas from archaeology underlie also the theories of urbanization. But Childe, and I should do this in English, shouldn't I, Fernando? Not everyone speaks Spanish here, because
I think most people would be somehow able to read. Yes, the large majority for sure.
But I'll speak in English just to make sure that everybody is incorporated into the conversation. But Childe did something amazing in the sense that when an archaeologist faces an archaeological site, she or he inevitably asks the question, am I facing a city, or is this just a village, or is it a hamlet? Where am I in the hierarchy between state-driven urban center and peripheral little village somewhere in the rural areas? And Gordon Childe came up with this list of 10 points that would allow any archaeologist to determine whether they're facing an urban revolution or not. And it's interesting, but within archaeology, one of the most heated debates I've noticed, because they're worse than architects. You think our debates are intense? You have to read the debates of the archaeologists. They're much more heated. But one point in which they have clashes is precisely this one. Very often they don't agree. Caral, for example, in Peru, some say this is the oldest city in the Americas, and some say that's not a city, that's a ceremonial site. Some sort of like an isolated Vatican, if you will. It's a ceremonial site that was visited by pilgrimage sporadically. It was never a city. And then they start fighting because some think that it was a city and some think it wasn't. So that means that we need to first figure out what is a city. How do we define city? What is the Western ontology of the city? What is the American so to speak, not American, the Amerindian, the First Nations ontology of a city, if there is such an ontology? So that's, I think, a critical question for us today. But the points that Child comes up with are obviously based on the cities that he was studying. He's Australian in origin, but he did most of his work in England, and he did his research in Mesopotamia and Europe. So he's looking at the Mediterranean and the ancient civilizations of the Mediterranean, and he's looking at Mesopotamia, which we know the oldest civilizations of the world stem there. But what I like about archaeology is that they go to the core of that critical question, which I think that architects and urbanists and landscape architects should also address. What is a city, and how was it spawned? And Charles says you can recognize a city by, one, looking at the extension, the density, the area. So size matters, he was saying. A tiny little thing, it's going to be very hard to argue that it was a city. Another thing that is critical, and that's why he locates it in second place, division of labor. So if you have a place where there's evidence of specialization, multiple activities, multi-functions, like in Teotihuacan, those murals where you see the little, the jugador de pelota, you see the priest, you see the administrator, you see the cacique, all sorts of functions. You see the script, the one that was registering, you have a division of labor. Teotihuacan was obviously a city. There's no doubt about it. Another thing they discuss is the concentration of superhabit in a place of the wealth that is being generated by the rural areas who are producing. They're producing the food that you can get tributes from. So tributes tended to be either in labor or in, say, maize, in grain, in corn, in the case of the Americas. Another thing is that what we discussed already, there are tributes that are being, in theocracies, given to either the deities, or they're being offered to a court. So we have a concentration. Cities are hierarchical. They tend to display more or less degrees of concentration, but an egalitarian city, that's a tough one. You have monumental architecture. It's interesting that monumental architecture is one of the items, and this is one of the most controversial when you look at Amazonian settlement patterns or conurbations, for example. But monumentality, I won't say just monumental architecture, let's say monumentality is another criteria for Child. And then you have, the clase dirigente, that you have a class that is in charge, in control, and many in the city, within the city, that depend on them. For example, artisans or artists would depend on that power-driven class, or the class that holds actual power. And then in civilizations, you will always find that there's one way or another of registering, of counting, of writing. There's stylistic complexity according to Charles. There's long distance trade. So there, you expect to see in a city items, products coming from far away. And there's a social organization that is based not anymore on, your last name, your ethnic group, your ayu, as we say in Quechua, your extended family. But you belong to a place, you're a Quiteño, or you're a Paulista. It's not Paulista, it's They told me that Paulista belongs to the department, but if you're from the city, you're something else.
Paulistano, yeah. Paulistano is from the city, Paulista, the state. Yeah.
Exactly, so you're Paulistano or you're Quiteño, but you're not anymore just like, the Duran family. So this list of 10 criteria has been extremely important to archaeology and also to theories on urbanism. And the linear narrative of the Neolithic and the urban revolution of Charles has been questioned. A lot of evidence has been accrued regarding how non-linear it actually was. So James Scott, for example, in this book, which I totally recommend, is arguing precisely in favor of the benefits, because we always present this linear narrative in terms of like, finally the barbarian emerges from its savage condition into a civilized condition, which is, you know, superior. But he's saying no, in many ways, the condition of the barbarian is superior. You're not subject to a state. You don't have to pay tribute. There's a freedom of movement. There's a self-determination that is I can't think of the word right now, that is surrendered when you become part of an urban system, and especially for peasants. So he's arguing, you know, by studying material from all sorts of disciplines, he's arguing that the story was not so linear and that it's been oscillating back and forth, and that very often you had hybrid conditions in which you had aspects that had to do with permanence and with permanent intensive agriculture, and other aspects that would keep nomadism, if you wish, or the life of the hunter-gatherer alive. And I think that's actually very Amazonian. So when I read this book, I was like, wow, this is very useful for me in terms of a theoretical framework, because in Amazonia, you see these hybrids that are about permanence, but they're also about migration and dynamism. Even villages move in Amazonia. And they're also about hunting, gathering, fishing, but also about a chakra and cultivating and fixing. So it wasn't so simple there. And it was confusing because the pattern from Amazonia does not fit into Western ontologies and understandings of the urban. But it was nice to read this book and see that this is actually broader than I expected. And I shared this in Facebook, Fernando, remember? I love this book. And I'm going to share some of the things that I've learned from this book, because this book was very enlightening for me. Because this semester, what I've been trying to do with the students is to ground the hypothesis that there is an urban ontology in the ancient Americas, and that ontology differs from the Western ontology. And I've been trying to figure out how. But for me, it was always about the way in which the quote unquote urban, the city, establishes a relationship with ecology, with nature, with habitat. And as I told you, the more I speak to archaeologists, the more I realize that this is actually something that has been discussed for a long time within archaeology, even though the debates are heated. But this is not something that has occurred to me. This is something that has occurred to many people who study settlement patterns, ancient settlement patterns in the Americas. But what was interesting about Mesoamerican Voices is that this is a book being written not by urbanists, not by architects, and not by archaeologists, but by linguists. Linguists who have learned Nahua, who have learned Aztec, Mixtec, all sorts of languages, and who have dedicated their life to translate these texts into English specifically for this book, but also into Spanish and other Western languages. And there's definitely something about language that is extremely revealing of ontology in a pretty strong way. But I think that the same exact thing happens in terms of spatial languages. That's why architects know when they're facing a different grammar, a different meaning, when there's a different structure, because these spaces they're encountering definitely don't match the spaces that they have learned to read that are so legible to them. So when you go into actual language, not just spatial language, boom, there you have evidence. And what they are arguing is that, talking about the pre-Columbian city, is that there were very complex and varied patterns of human settlement in the Americas. This is specifically in the 16th century, because the texts that they're translating are the texts that the Nahuas and the Mixtecas and the Olmecs and many other cultures in Mesoamerica specifically were writing when they learned the alphabet. So they were writing in Nahua, they were writing in their language, but they were using the Spanish alphabet. That was one of the innovations that they picked up from Europe with amazing speed. They loved the alphabet apparently and learned it in one generation. So you had all the elites of the original peoples of the Mesoamerica writing their story and their viewpoints of the conquest in their own languages, but using the alphabet. So for example, reading about that, I learned that the Nahuas called what has been translated as city or as town or as ethnic state, local state, city state. There are very many translations. Some people just call them now neighborhoods or communities because the Altepetls have been conurbated into cities like Mexico City. But Altepetl is that ethnic state, and Altepem is the plural for Altepetl, and there were thousands of them in the 16th century. Not a few, thousands of them. This is important because we have this understanding that, that we live in a territory where we associate that which is quote unquote indigenous with the rural, with the peasant life, with, this backward campesino lifestyle. And this is a very urban culture that we're facing in the 16th century. Their language was Nahuatl, of course, but Nahuatl was spoken in hundreds of dialects. And in terms of the urban structure, they say that each Altepetl was composed of several Calpoji or Tlaxilacali, which were important in terms of, tribute and also labor, how you organize that. Because they did have a very hierarchical elite, and the Tlatoani was the dynastic ruler, and the Calpoji were an administrative unit, also for land management. Octavio Paz also speaks about the Calpoji of Mexico and of ancient Nahua culture in his book, Laberinto de la Soledad. Also speaking of it in terms of this unit that was about land. So a Calpoji was a unit of communal land. And in the Inca Empire, there was something analogous. In the Inca Empire, you had like 3 levels of communal labor and of communal land management. The land tended to be divided in a tripartite fashion. 1/3 was for the Inca, 1/3 was for the priests, and 1/3 was for the community. And within, when that land was subdivided in terms of size of the family, for example, so larger families would get more land than smaller families. A single woman would get less land than a small family, and so on and so forth. So they had a way of dividing the land as well. But it was always communal, even though the right of use, so to speak, could be, the family that worked, the family piece of land would create products that were used by the family. The products were theirs. And, some for tribute. But that, you still see that happening in Amazonia, for example, where you have, like in the Anyangu community, or you have a communal system of land, but within the communal system, each family has a plot of land with a chakra, with a polyculture, and the products of that chakra belong to the family. So it's a very different way of thinking about property that we face here as well. And of course, the most famous Altepetl of the world of the Nahuas is Mexico Tenochtitlan, which was one Altepetl in the lake of Texcoco, which had many Altepetls like Xochimilco and others. You probably know that already because it's one of the most known cultures. But think about the urban structure. We already said that. Other Altepetl of the Valley of Mexico. Let's move on. But what's interesting about these linguists is that they're arguing that what we refer to as the Aztec Empire, in terms of Western culture, as this like monolithic, powerful Roman Empire, the Aztec Empire, they're saying that that's completely misunderstanding the culture of Mesoamerica, that it is more accurately described as a loose confederation of a patchwork of territories across Central and Southern Mexico that were conquered when the conquest happened by the Triple Alliance. So what you have in this system of Altepetls is that, there's warfare going on between them, of course, but also alliances. And alliances are generally also related to parentesco. They're generally intermarrying. And that is a way of consolidating alliances. And that system was applied when the Spaniards arrived too. That's why mestizaje started right away, because many of the conquistadores who were male, Colón didn't arrive with women that I know of. He did arrive with Africans, but I'm not sure about the women. And many of these these conquistadores married the princesses, the daughters of the caciques, the curacas, the ethnic leaders of the Altepetls and other cities in other cultures. So it's interesting to see how the Spaniards really figured out how to marry into these structures in order to gain more power and move further with their conquest. So the conquest was much messier than we think of it. But then you also had, the Mixtecs. And what's interesting about the Mixtecs is that among them, the rulers could be male or female. And they had a similar urban structure to an analogous, I shouldn't say similar because the diversity is huge, but they had an analogous urban structure. They organized their city-states, the regions in terms of news. And of course, their alliances were even easier to consolidate when you had a female ruler marrying a male ruler. But you could also have the children marrying with each other. And that way you would create confederations or go to war, whatever. But you see the same thing among I'm sorry, I don't know why I cannot use my mouse nor the arrows. So I'm doing this with a pad and it's very unstable. The Mayas in Yucatan and Central America also had these ethnic cities which were called Ka. And there were also hundreds of them in this area in colonial Yucatan. They spoke Maya and they also had hereditary dynasties, and the ruler, the Tlatoani of the Mayas was the Bataf. So what's fascinating to me about these descriptions of the 16th century is that you realize that each one of these thousands of city-states had a specific name that was related to the ruling nobility, a tribute system, a market, especially in Mesoamerica. This varies a little bit where you have strong states like the Inca, but markets were everywhere in South America too. Quito is famous for its market. You had a different origin legend, a deity, and a separate identity, which included the language. I didn't write language here, I'm sorry. Language should be in there. And in the case of the Mayas, for example, the castes were not subdivided. So that's a structural difference in terms of the space. But then you start thinking about it and you think, my God, in the Andes, sort of similar. In the Quechua world of Peru and the Quechua world of Ecuador, and obviously Quechua of Bolivia as well, you had the Purina Jactas and the Kikin Jactas. And the Kikin Jactas were these like concentrations of power within the constellation of Purina Jactas. You had a system that was obviously hierarchical and had primary, secondary, tertiary, and even how do I say, after tertiary in English, quaternary hierarchies in terms of the organization of the region, and it's analogous. But if we think a little bit more about the language, you're facing a city, specifically in the case of the Nahuas, but you could analyze one language after the other. The etymology of these words. In the case of Altepetl, I thought, wow, Popocatépetl is a volcano and Iztaccíhuatl is a volcano. Why is it that the word for city and the word for volcano share a suffix? So I went, to look at the dictionary, and I learned that Tepetl means cerro or sierra. It refers to a mountain. It refers to the land. And al means water. So there you have an etymology of the urban, of the city, that has two particles, one water and the other one land. That is to me fascinating. That reinforces my idea that we're facing a different ontology of the city and of the urban, which is truly about an urban ecology, which is so fashionable right now and so contemporary, but in the Americas, it's ancestral. And then you have the urbs, the urbis, and that word comes from civitas. It comes from city. Urbs, urbis means city, and city comes from civitas, which comes from the quality of being civis, the quality of being, and here the emphasis is on the citizen. So in a beautiful way, in the etymology, you're facing a culture that is extremely anthropocentric, where the emphasis is on the citizen. It is the quality of the citizen that makes the city, and a culture that is extremely nature-centric, so to speak, even though the word nature doesn't make much sense in the ontology of the ancestral Americas. But let's use that word for lack of a better way of discussing this. And that was the Octavio Paz that I mentioned, but we already spoke about that. So I'm going to go further because this is a very long lecture, actually. And I don't want to hold you for too long. But basically, just to summarize it, we have that another common trait of these cultures going all the way from Canada to the Fueguinos in the Patagonia. We're facing what Viveiros de Castro probably would call, and many anthropologists have talked about this, these like relativism, I'll just say Native American relativism, this ontology that is profoundly indigenous. There's that horrible word again, but anyway, just to go faster. And one of the traits of that different way of being as a culture is precisely that much of the city making is really landscaping. It is habitat built up. And that's something that is very difficult for our Western mentalities to understand, because we think of the city in terms of the Mesopotamian model or the Greco-Roman model, where you have a cell, the compact city, with one or more walls, outside of it, the rural area, and beyond it, the hinterland that provisions the city. But here we're facing a very different language, so to speak, spatial language, where you don't have these separations, where everything is interwoven. It's much more like a tissue. So think about it. In the Americas, just in the Amazon, about 300 languages are spoken. Imagine in the Americas how many languages are spoken today. Imagine how many more languages were spoken in the 16th century. So what amazes me about the system of urban constellation in the Americas is that they were built on two notions that I think are very important to us. One is autonomy, and the other one is diversity. So when I look at the pre-Columbian cities, I understand the plights of the indigenous movement in Ecuador today. One of the things that they have fought for years, for decades, for centuries, is what we call the Estado pluricultural y pluriétnico, which is the pluricultural and pluriethnic state. And when I read that now, I cannot not embed it in the deep history of these peoples. This is what they had in the 16th century when the Spaniards arrived. They had this ability, not that they didn't fight. I'm not idealizing, the pre-Columbian world. There were wars. There were pretty brutal wars. These groups would often fight with each other for very many reasons. But they had a system of coexistence of diversity that was incredibly strong. And they had a system in which each one of these altepeme, altepetel, could preserve its identity as an ethnic state. It could preserve its autonomy. And this was always obviously dynamic and changing, but that was a continuous aspiration, I think, from a socio-political standpoint for ancient Americans, and still for their, these are living cultures. So for their descendants as well. So I'll just read this very fast. Mesoamericans live in ethnic states ruled by hereditary nobility. So that's clear. They had well-organized markets. That's important. Marked social distinctions, writing or record-keeping systems and calendars, systems of taxation, military organizations, state religions, and priesthoods. The sedentary people of Mesoamerica also practice monumental architecture and metalworking and produce fine textile ceramics and sculptures, among many other crafts. But the wealth of these cultures is mind-boggling. And this, I think, played against them during the conquest, because when you have a system of autonomies, and you have a truly, an empire of the Western type coming to face this system of autonomies, it is very hard for the system of autonomies to survive as such. And that's precisely what happened. The Spaniards, but I think that the Portuguese as well, although the Portuguese colonial pattern is completely different. I definitely don't want to get into that subject because that's another lecture. But so I'll focus on the Spaniards. The Spaniards were obsessed with concentrating the populations. They couldn't stand these constellations. They were dispersed, they were diffused, they were all over the place. And for them, it was about the cell, it was about concentration. So the missions would create their reductions, las reducciones. And the Spaniards, since day one, wanted to concentrate, the quote unquote indigenous populations, which were all over the place, because otherwise it was impossible to control them. So this truly imperial system that was about centralization, concentration of populations, segregation of function into rural, urban, hinterland, forest, started reshaping the land. I honestly don't think that the Spaniards even understood that they were facing a different ontology. We still don't understand it today. It's very difficult, or at least it has been for me. And it is also important to understand that the identity of these autonomous constellations was based on that, on that particle within the constellation. So you didn't have Nawa identity in the sense that we have right now. For example, an Ecuadorian identity that has been built through a symbolic nation state buildup that has nothing to do with the underlying a constellation pattern of these ethnic states. So at many levels, you're facing two completely different paradigms and two completely different ontologies that up to this day don't understand each other and are still negotiating. But of course, when you look at these at images like this one from the Florentine Codex, this one is the one that catches my eye the most, because one of the things that they mention over and over again in these texts that were written by the Nahuas and the mystics, and well, in the Andes, you have to read Huamampoma and the Inca Garcilaso de la Vega to get the perspective, not the European perspective, but the other perspective, the profoundly American perspective. One of the things that really shocked them, and they speak about it often, is that the Spaniards would go into their storehouses and pick up everything that had a metal in it, gold, silver especially, and discard everything else. They would discard the feathers, they would discard anything that was made from a natural material. And for them, it was shocking because that was extremely valuable in the world of the Aztecs, for example, of the Nahuas in this case. So to me, this is revealing, because in contemporary Latin America, we still have, a deep ontological separation between the indigenous movements that claim that life cannot be undervalued in the name of oil or copper or gold or silver, and a culture that values that above everything else, above the forest, above the water, above the fish, above animal life. And these two systems of value don't understand each other very well. But in one of them, a feather is gold. The Spaniards would take the feathers and just throw them in the plaza in front of the temples and burn them. And that was absolutely upsetting to the Nahuas. And of course, now that we are undergoing a pandemic, it does help me to understand what I've read 1,000 times, that it was the pandemics that decimated the populations of the Americas. Archaeologists estimate that everywhere, not just in Amazonia, the populations were reduced to 10% of what they were originally. So imagine the scale of this cataclysm. It's very difficult to imagine, but COVID helps in terms of, we're losing 5 to 10% of our population, and it's extremely upsetting. I cannot even imagine what our ancient cultures experienced in the 16th century. but it helps to empathize with them. And of course, in the codices, you also see the indigenous perspective of the conquest, in the sense that very often they portray themselves as the conquistadores as well. Because sometimes these groups would go into war. Some of them, I mean, imagine the Aztecs. How many enemies did Moctezuma have at that time? And many of those enemies allied with the Spaniards against Moctezuma. So there's this vision, and there's the Malinche there, that they are conquering other groups themselves. So they're winning the war as well. We can move forward a little bit faster to look at the city making impulse of the pre-Columbians. Let's go further. But just to emphasize that these are living cultures, that the amount of people that speak Nahua just in Mexico is like in the Andes, the amount of people that speak Quechua, thousands and thousands of them. But for example, this image is very revealing. This is a cartography of Zempoala. Zempoala is one of the groups that allied with the Spaniards against Moctezuma, well, against the Aztecs, and they're in Veracruz. And what's fascinating about these cartographies that you see here again, also the concept of mestizaje or hybridity, which defines us, happening also in the city. So you have, the territorial component of the city, which was really about the mountains, the lakes, the water sources, the vegetation, the animals. Look at everything that is included in the cartography. And the elements that matter to the Spaniards, the cathedral, the main plaza, which was generally overlapping a market or a temple plaza from the pre-Columbian city, and the cabildo, and all three powers surrounding the plaza. So to me, this is super interesting as well, in terms of showing how one ontology of the territorial city is being interwoven with a very different ontology that came from the other side of the ocean, and how that defines our cities today. But then you have the laws of Indies coming afterwards, of course. Sorry. And when you read about these cities, and you go to the, this is the European perspective, it's important to read it as well. Hernán Cortés was the first one to write about Tenochtitlan, but you also have many chronicles for all of Latin America that are worth reading. But listen to that, and should I translate, or do you guys mind the Spanish?
No, we read the Spanish.
Okay, but listen to that description. La calle, que es muy ancha, muy hermosa y derecha, que de un cabo se parece al otro y tiene 2/3 de legua, y de la una parte y de la otra muy buenas y grandes casas, así de aposentamientos como de mezquitas. Interesting that they use the word mezquita. Spain was very Arabic and Jewish. Y el dicho Moctezuma venía por medio de la calle con 2 señores. Esta gran ciudad de Tenochtitlán, está fundada en esta laguna salada, y desde la tierra firme hasta el cuerpo de la dicha ciudad, por cualquiera parte que quisieran entrar a ella, hay 2 leguas. Tiene 4 entradas, todas de calzada hecha a mano, tan ancha como 2 lanzas jinetas. So imagine the size of this road. Es tan grande la ciudad como Sevilla o Córdoba. And this is one Altepetl. Imagine, there were thousands of them. So there were thousands of Sevillas or Córdobas in Mesoamérica in the 16th century. Son las calles de ella, digo, las principales, muy anchas y muy derechas. Y algunas de estas y todas las demás son la mitad de tierra y por la otra mitad es agua, por la cual andan en sus canoas, y todas las calles de trecho a trecho están abiertas por donde atraviesa el agua de unas a las otras, y en todas estas aberturas, que algunas son muy anchas, hay sus puentes de muy anchas y muy grandes vigas, juntas y recias y bien labradas, y tales que por muchas de ellas pueden pasar 10 de a caballo juntos a la par. Y viendo que si los naturales de esta ciudad quisiesen hacer alguna traición, tenían para ello mucho aparejo, por ser la dicha ciudad edificada de la manera que digo, y quitadas las puentes de las entradas y salidas, nos podrían dejar morir de hambre sin que pudiésemos salir a la tierra. Tiene esta ciudad muchas plazas donde hay continuo mercado y trato de comprar y vender. The issue of the market, also worthy of note. It's just not one, two plazas, like in the laws of Indies. It's several plazas, and they're huge. And there are several markets. This is also still a contemporary trait of the cities that we're still fighting to extirpate. Quito's trying to get rid of one of its main markets in the colonial Quito right now. They've been kicking markets out of the city forever. Tiene otra plaza tan grande como 2 veces la ciudad de Salamanca. So imagine the scale, how he's describing it. Toda cercada de portales alrededor donde hay cotidianamente arriba de 70,000 ánimas comprando y vendiendo, donde hay todos los géneros de mercaderías que en todas las tierras se hallan, así de mantenimiento como de vituallas, joyas de oro y plata, de plomo, de latón, de cobre, de estaño, de piedras, de hueso, de conchas, de caracoles y de plumas. So this description says it all. You know, this is a European mind reacting to a Mesoamerican city. And it is, there's a book called The Conquest of America where Todorov asks himself the question, why did someone who so hyperbolically describes Tenochtitlan made such an effort to destroy it? It's a profound question, and that book has a profound answer, but you know, it still comes up when you read this kind of text. And this, you know, when you put the plan, I don't know whether I have that next to each other at some point in this presentation, but it's interesting to put the plan of Tenochtitlan next to the plan of Madrid in the 16th century, because one of the cities is a medieval pattern, and the other one is this like insanely planned mega scale city. And of course, in the case of Tenochtitlan, what played against them is that the knowledge that their enemies had of the way the city worked contributed to the conquest of Tenochtitlan, because they realized that it was easy to site it if you could cut it away from the only arteries that connected it across the water to the surrounding provisioning hinterland. And that's exactly what they did. And, you know, you could keep on going and going. This one I inserted because it's interesting also to understand this part. I inserted this because I'm very interested in landscape and how these cultures related to landscape architecture, to how they landscape the cities. And look at that, que son en torno 1,600 de la otra parte del andén hacia la pared de la huerta. So there are huertas in the city, but todo labrado de cañas con unas vergas y detrás de ellas, todo de arboledas y hierbas olorosas, y dentro de la alberca hay mucho pescado y muchas aves, así como lavancos y zarzotas y otros géneros de ave de agua, tantas que muchas veces casi cubren el agua. I recently read a book that UNAM is going to be publishing on Nahua Gardens. And it is fascinating because Nahua Gardens, once again, were really designs of habitat. Lots of animals, water, all sorts of plants. They were like truly living what we have later during the naturalist period, you know, the typology of the Jardín Botánico coming up in Europe. In a way, I feel that the Jardín Botánico is a response to the landscaping of the tropics and subtropics in the Americas that have these natural jardines botánicos that contained everything, that really were designed thinking in terms of ecologies and how to put them together and how to take advantage of all these known interrelationships between animal species and plant species and tree species. This one's from that book. Para los bosques cercados, al menos según lo que se menciona en Alba, sorry about this, Ixtlilxochitl y el códice Xolotl, se tiene como atributos la arquitectura, los cercados y muchas veces templos, la fauna y la flora nativa. La fauna era cazada, lo que hace suponer que la función de los bosques cercados era la caza asociada a la religión, la memoria y tradición, por su pasado como cazadores recolectores que aún continuaban siéndolo, y al poder en veces como recreación. So this takes you back to Scott, because the city that they're describing is a hybrid in the sense that it has both components to it, the permanent settlement of the state, if you wish, or of the theocracy, of the temples and the markets and the mega plazas, but also the city of the forests where you can hunt, where you can collect, and the city of the orchards, of the chakras, where you can cultivate, where you can have an agroecology that is also urban. So to me, all of this information adds up just to confirm that we're facing an extremely fascinating ontology that is very significant to the contemporary world, that we really need to pay attention to it before we keep exterminating it everywhere, but particularly in Amazonia, because we want to modernize Amazonia. But okay, Bernal Díaz del Castillo, another one of the chronicles, also describes diversidad de árboles y los olores que cada uno tenía, andenes llenos de rosas y flores, muchos frutales, rosales de la tierra, estanque de agua dulce. No, he speaks about a vergel, the grandes canoas, is over and over again. When you read the cronistas and you pay attention to the landscape descriptions in the city, there, I mean, the examples are by the hundreds. But why does this happen to me? I don't know how to.
It's a good time to stop and let's see if the members of the group have any questions. So yes. We have another 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes to.
Oh my God, it's already 5:30. I'm sorry about that. I can talk about this nonstop. And this is just one.
I love it. Thank you so much. This is amazing. We need to continue this conversation because this is amazing stuff.
This is 25% of what I have for you, but I'm just so. And
well, you have to come back. You have to come back.
Yeah, English is my second language, and I have a hard time sometimes articulating ideas in English when I'm tired, especially. But yeah, I had afterwards, just to tell you what I had, because we won't have time to go through it. I had cases from Amazonia, from the Andes, from Tierra del Fuego, from all over the place, really, because it doesn't matter where you use Sumir.
No, you need to come back, Ana Maria. We need to have you again to talk more. You're getting into something really powerful here. You're getting into this essence of what it means to live in the Americas, right? This is the essence of our research group. This is the essence of the questions that we are all asking in our research. So I want to open to the PhD students and Professor Victoria Sanchez, who is participating from Colombia, to see if they have questions for you.
Absolutely.
Maybe I have a question, Ana Maria.
Yeah.
So, well, you described a little bit of the chakra, right? The Amazonian chakra or the Amazonian chakra, right? So I think that was a very interesting concept. It's something that I encountered when I personally designed a project, the one that I told you about like maybe 2 years ago.
I love that project.
Yeah, so it was fascinating for me, especially, coming from Quito to be working outside, in the Amazonian, right in the middle, in the border between the Andes and the Amazonia, and to discover that concept. And I think ever since I have always wondered of the encounter of, there's so much knowledge embedded in the just 3 hours away, from Quito, that we have not incorporated into our practice or anything in reality. So and so the question is, maybe, I don't know if you can elaborate about this, but maybe, how is that, what is the role of the architect? What is the role of how we kind of inter-exchange or how we can merge these knowledges, or incorporate these knowledges into our practice. There's a vast knowledge down there that is fascinating, that few of us, or a few practitioners know about. So I don't know if you can tell us a little bit about that.
I mean, if I can share some images that I had here, just so that I can do both things at the same time. Let me go down to now I can do it with the thing. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Let me go down, 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 down. Amazonia is a long story, but let's go into the chakras. These are the chakras of one of the groups that I've been studying for my dissertation. This is specifically the Anyangu, Quichua, Napo Runa in the Napo River. And these are their chakras. So here you see the pattern very well. And the shocking thing for me is that this is where I started. I didn't start studying the Altepetl of Mesoamerica or the Inca settlement patterns. No, I didn't start. I started in the Amazon, in the fringes, looking at these patterns that were mind-boggling. And it is by understanding these patterns at the micro scale that I was able to understand the city at the macro scale. Because it's like a fractal in the ontology of urbanism of the Americas. You have a fractal pattern. You have these constellations, and it doesn't matter whether you zoom into the scale or you zoom out, the same logic applies. And that's something fascinating to me. So it is sort of shocking that thanks to an understanding of a tiny rural settlement in the Napo, I was able to figure out, the Altepetl. But, or I think it has enlightened me because this gave me the pattern. But what you have is, the little clearing that you always find around the house. In the case of the Napo Runa, of course, because the diversity is immense, but one principle that you see over and over in Amazonia is the principle of the chakra, the polyculture that surrounds the house, which is more of an agriculture, if you wish, but obviously combined, imitating the forest. It's a different ontology of agriculture. And then you have a managed forest around it that many Amazonians have described. And then you have the forest, further out, which is also managed, but the degree of management is less. And let me show you another image. This is in the Baure in Bolivia. We don't have time, but this one's important because this one allowed me to understand at the regional scale what's happening with these urban constellations of Amazonia. You have these gardens, these islands, these pockets of forest that are connected by roads. One of my students is zooming in and studying more specific nuclei within this constellation. This is ginormous. I mean, look at the scale so that you get a sense. But not just here in the Xingu, let me show you very fast, Ecuadorian Amazonia. We don't have time to go into all of these, but this is something that's happening right now, Ernesto, and you're going to be as fascinated as I am because I couldn't believe it. I invited the Brazilian archaeologist, Eduardo Neves, to give a lecture in my class the other day. Someone I totally recommend for a lecture on Amazonia for your group. And Eduardo showed these images because I was Ecuadorian. So he's like, I'm going to start with the Ecuadorian case of urbanization in Amazonia. And he showed what has come up as we are searching for gold in the Ecuadorian Amazon. These are LiDAR images that were funded by the Ecuadorian government and the gold companies in Ecuador, which are from Canada, I believe Australia and China. Prospecting for gold, they found this. Look at that. I mean, when you pay attention to the LiDAR image, you will realize that the extent of the settlement is regional. And again, it's a constellation pattern. Here, it's about the settlement, the small ethnic group, the chakra, the forest, everything, the managed forest. It's all happening simultaneously, but at a scale which is much greater than what you see when you go to work in the Anyangu here. And it's ancestral. But what do we do when we work in Amazonia? We're always imposing these paradigms to Latin America that are not from our territories, that didn't stem from the logic of our territory. So in Ecuador, to me, the greatest irony, and I'm critiquing it in my dissertation, is that across the river, you have the Ciudad del Milenio, which is an eco-village designed top-down by the Ecuadorian government according to the Earth Institute formula of the eco-village. And you want me to show you an image very fast? Let me share the screen quickly so that we talk with, I mean, we love images, architects. We like talking with with the facts on the ground. This is another presentation that was not for today, but I have some images in this one of the eco village. Where is it? I mean, I should have it somewhere. Oh God, can't believe I don't have a Ciudad del Milenio. It's easy just to Google it, I think. But this is the Ciudad del Milenio, the Millennium City, a model coming from Columbia University, from the Earth Institute run by Jeffrey Sachs, and Ciudad del Milenio. And of course, they're proposing something that they considered super ecological. They're not even looking at the local patterns or how people actually live there and ask themselves why. And this is what they do. So to me, this is like the last irony of Amazonian planning. Amazonia is full of carcasses of planning, and this is just the last one. And of course, here you see a pattern that even has bikes embedded in them. But when I interviewed all these families, which don't all live there because they go to their chacras, so the closer they live to the Ciudad del Milenio, the more they spend time there. But the farther away their chacras are, the less time they spend in the Ciudad del Milenio. And what they were saying to me is, yeah, they gave us bikes, but you know what? Amazonia is very muddy. So the bikes don't work very well here, but we're using them in this area where we can use them, basically for heavy things so that we can take them down to the port. So to me, this is fascinating because once again, even if the model is an eco model, it is based on assumptions that have nothing to do with the Amazonian ontology of inhabitation. And I think that we would benefit from studying, researching, learning, describing that ontology so that if we're going to do any state-driven plan, we can do it with community planning embedded in it. Because otherwise it becomes one more layer of the carcass of modernization of Amazonia. And the examples are many, from Forlandia in the Tapajós, you have the Transamazonica, you have the oil access in Ecuador, you have before that the failure of the Madeira-Mamoré railway. I mean, it's just like a piling of bad ideas because we keep on imposing a paradigm that does not work, that was invented for another territory and it just lands on Amazonia. In Amazonia, it becomes evident. You have Manaus. I always say that Manaus, Iquitos, and Tenochtitlan are the three most brilliant case studies to show the clash between these paradigms. Because in Iquitos, for example, you have a floating city that is extremely resilient to inundation because in Amazonia, water and soil are always moving. So the city moves with the landscape. And no, what do? The Spaniards arrive into Iquitos, just like it happened in Tenochtitlan. They don't want to live in the water. So they need to build a zócalo. They need to desiccate the ground. They need to desiccate the land. And there's a beautiful book written specifically for Tenochtitlan, for Mexico City, about the desagüe and the mega infrastructure that the Spaniards built to drain the city. Imagine the investment that went into this. Money, labor, everything. And her name is Vera Candiani, if you want to read her. She's an Argentinian who teaches at Princeton and wrote this amazing book about the process that took a couple of centuries to drain the lake of Texcoco so that they could have the dry land. Obviously, there's also an economic reason to do this because land is worth a lot of money. So if you have desiccated land, you cannot sell lake, but you can sell land. And within the ontology in which land as merchandise is valued, which was probably not the ontology of the Aztecs, because otherwise they would have substituted the lake for the land, but yes, they chose not to. So they lived with the water. The same in Iquitos, they lived with the water. The same in Manaus, they lived with the water. But then you have in the 70s, the dictatorship of Brazil under Castelo Branco, finally enacting an idea that comes from before. It comes from, what is his name, Vargas? The famous president, Getulio Vargas.
Vargas, yes, that's correct.
And that idea was concocted in the Vargas era, but it wasn't enacted until the dictatorship where it was deployed as a free trade zone. And part of deploying the free trade zone was desiccating Manaus. and eliminating the floating city. And with these, of course, I don't want to romanticize a condition of poverty. The floating city of Iquitos is extremely poor, but does it have to be? I'm just trying to recuperate the ontology of the floating city, which with investment, the investment that other areas get in terms of public services and all sorts of things, with a decentralized model of electricity generation, of bathroom, water treatment, could work. And the floating city could be a different, fascinating, fantastic, and model of well-being in Amazonia. But we choose not to investigate the benefits of the floating city and to upgrade it and improve it and rethink it so that they can also have electricity and a bathroom and anything else that people in Iquitos may want. But what we do is just like, boom, erase it and build upon it with, another model that is not as welcome in Amazonia, I feel. And you see
Maria,
over and over again. Yeah?
No, people have to leave to other meetings.
Yes.
So thank you so much for your presentation. It was super amazing. We need to continue that conversation. And I want to give you the opportunity to say any last words before I need to let the students go.
Thank you, Fernando. Well, I just want to apologize with you guys because I'm very bad with time management. I'm very Latina like that. And I wanted to share so much more.
It was an amazing conversation, and you need to come back. We need to have you back here.
We'll see each other again. And
for more of that conversation.
And with what you're doing, it's very significant and relevant, and we need to join forces because the ontologies of our continents do need to get more attention and do need to somehow infiltrate a contemporary planning, especially of the ecological city. That's how I feel.
You are a fundamental part of it. So thank you.
Thank you, Fernando. Thanks for inviting me.
Continue that conversation.
And nice meeting all of you. Take care of yourselves.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye. Ciao.
Anna, thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Take care.
Continue talking about the ontologies.
We will. Stay well.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Chao, Ana María, qué gusto verte.
Lo mismo, querido Ernesto. Nos vemos. Chao, chao.
Bye.